Good afternoon, and welcome to episode 17 of Inside Out, a quarterly webcast where Thinka's co-founders, Ben and Lee, talk through all the weird and wonderful hard and human parts of business and leadership. In case you missed that first sentence, we've shifted our events to quarterly. Preview, then Inside Out, and then Ask Me Anything, all on one topic, and the topic will change each quarter. This quarter, we're all about psychological safety. Today, we're focusing on one big question. How can leaders create environments that balance team safety with accountability? We had one question through on the registration form which we'd like to spotlight, which Ben and Lee will try and weave in, which is how can leadership be proactive in building trust, fostering transparency, and creating psychological safety in a jaded workplace?
Today, we're talking all things psych safety and accountability. But I guess before we get into that piece around how psych safety needs to sit side by side with accountability, I really want to establish what we're talking about when we talk about psychological safety and thinking about it from the perspective of Dr. Amy Edmondson, who popularized the concept in the 90s. So, going back to sort of the research she was doing, she was looking at errors in the healthcare system. So that was what her PhD was all about. And she was exploring that as her topic. And out of that, she discovered a really interesting insight where she noticed that high performing teams were actually reporting more errors. And that was a really surprising finding because most people would assume that when you've got a high performing team, that's not going to be the case. Like that would be kind of the overriding assumption. But what she found was there was a reporting of errors because in those particular teams, there was enough safety to be able to admit to mistakes, to be able to put them on the table for discussion and to talk through concerns and approach that in a very candid manner. So, generally speaking, where there's high performing teams, there might be more errors because they're out there, they're transparent, and people are taking ownership of them. So, funnily enough, in the original concept around psych safety, it wasn't divorced from accountability. In fact, there was high ownership when we're looking at it in its original form. I think, though, over the years, it's become part of the corporate world and people are speaking about it more and more. It's become kind of synonymous with this idea of a nice culture, a safe culture, a comfortable culture. And perhaps we've lost a little bit of that accountability piece that is a big part of it because candid conversations are hard and they are often about accountability. So we're kind of trying to bring that back today and really point to this idea that psych safety and accountability do often go hand in hand because you can't kind of work in an environment where it's safe to speak up, where you want to report mistakes, where you want to learn together without an accountability to keep growing and to keep achieving high performance. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about psych safety. It's that ability to take those interpersonal risks within the group and not to be punished or humiliated or judged, but just to be able to put those issues on the table, admit to those mistakes, own them, and then raise concerns where it's warranted. So, definitely not about niceness, definitely not about comfort or safety in the traditional sense of the word, but all about being candid, transparent, and owning.
I think, if I was to put my leader hat on just for a moment, I think that's a skill that we need to get back to helping leaders to really understand is when you're facilitating conversations or facilitating collaboration and you're bringing different perspectives and ideas around and into it, how do you make sure that you can still point the group in a direction that is really productive? Because you've still got to be able to make sure that people understand, where we're going. And sometimes that can be a challenge when you're trying to include everyone at the same time. So it's that ability just to not put too much on the table at the same time and facilitate a really strong conversation that can be very divergent to start, but then it becomes very convergent.
Yeah.
We're pointing in
Yeah,
this direction. This is what we need to get done. And this is what A, B, C, and D are responsible for. And we're going to check back in next week
yeah.
if A, B, C, and D have actually achieved that as well. Like two speeds is really critical in psych safety.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you're kind of alluding to the model that perhaps all of us have become familiar with. You need that includer safety to kind of kick off the building of a psych safety culture. So inclusion and then learning and then collaboration and then kind of you're moving towards challenger safety where you feel like you can step into I wouldn't say conflict to the tension or the disagreements a little more robustly, but if you don't have psych safety, you kind of got to work through the process
Mm,
until you get to that point. But I guess the point is when you get to challenger safety, that's where you know you've kind of nailed the concept because everyone goes, like, I hear what you're saying, but have we thought about X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I realized when we were talking through it yesterday in our team session that it's one of those things that I've always understood as a general sense, but never looked properly at well enough to really understand where those misconceptions lie. And it feels like one of those things where it's like, those common phrases where it's like we've gotten so used to a version of it that we forget what the original one was. Like the early bird catches the worm. Like the whole phrase is the early bird catches the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. And
mm,
so it's like it's not always good to be the first word
Yeah,
out. Like there
yeah,
is more to that phrase than that, and there is more to this concept than we often think about. And it's about admitting to not even mistakes, but errors. So
mm,
like that you don't have to have made a mistake. There was an error that a path you could have taken or should have taken instead of the one that you did. But it's also that it's not about that it's okay for you to make mistakes. It's more about your
mm,
acknowledgement and your accountability over those mistakes or errors that are made. And we so
yeah,
commonly think about psychological safety as this place where it's okay to make mistakes. And the other bit about it is that it's the type of work that it's okay to make them in. Like it's not okay to make them in repetitive work that you do all the time. Like if you
yeah,
do that
yeah.
work all the time, that should have a lot lower error rates.
Mm,
Whereas it's okay to make errors when you're taking risks and you're doing things
learning.
differently
Mm,
and it can be unpacked. And it's about a place that's safe for you to do those things, for you to say, place that's safe for you to take risks and be accountable for what comes out of it. Not
mm.
that it's okay for you to take a risk and for it to not work out and you go, oh, look, we couldn't have seen that coming.
Yeah, yeah.
If I was to be a leader, one of the easiest strategies I've often used to distill the difference between the two is, do we need to collaborate? Do we need to execute? Like, is it time to jump in and have a
Yeah.
conversation and get people on board and work towards a common goal? Because there is opportunities to move and shape this particular initiative, process, whatever it might be, or is it just an execution lane? We need to keep driving towards it and it needs to be done consistently. Because I think often we have used or we've turned psych safety into an excuse to avoid the standards. So if we've set high standards and feel like we're pushing maybe the team too hard, often
Mm,
we will find a way to compromise because we're feeling like that we're putting too much pressure on the team. But not everything, like you've said, needs to actually have, the revisit or the conversation around it. It can just be in the execution lane. And that's where your standards come from, is when you do things consistently well for a
mhm.
prolonged period of time. Very rarely, unless you're at the Winter Olympics, of course, and you have your golden moment, it doesn't often come, but it comes from discipline, from consistency, from doing things. But how do those Olympians get to that peak? Training, consistency, making sure that they are disciplined to their own high standards before that event actually came. So when we think about the workplace, making sure that we do have the things in the execute, do it often, do it well lane, and then the collaborate, think differently and new ideas lane as well is a really nice way to look at it. The end goal might be sitting in challenger safety, but we've got to get through a few different phases to get there. And often there are people, I think this is me, by the way, will sit in challenger quite naturally and want people.
Mm,
But if we're not there as an
yeah,
organization, it can feel really intimidating or it can feel really like we're sitting in a place of dysfunction when one person's in one place, the other person isn't there, or you haven't acknowledged that you need to do some work before that person feels comfortable. But it shouldn't be divorced from the ability to, disagree. I always have liked this quote: is your team brave enough to disagree and disciplined enough to deliver? Like, you've got to be
mm,
able to feel the
love that.
tension, go back and forth, but still commit to what you're all going to get done and by when. Because in moments of frustration, often we want to just feel like we want to get out of the room or end the call, and we miss that piece because it's like, oh God, we just need some relief from this uncomfortable and this tension.
Yeah,
And maybe in that moment, because there is tension, because we can't agree on maybe something, it's we're going to come back to this in one day, in 1 hour, in however long, but that is the next action. And that is often where accountability and psych safety comes into it because we're never divorcing the next action from the last. We actually know what's going to come next, what's happening.
I was thinking a lot about like what's a really good example of
Mm.
psychological safety and accountability in action in a team. And we had a lot of case studies we were throwing around in our discussions leading up to today. But the best example I could think of was happened while I was sitting on the couch watching the Winter Olympics. So, for those of you at home who were right into the Winter Olympics, watching the Moguls team and their success, they won half of our medal count at the Winter Olympics. Incredible team. And this particular team, this Moguls team, was interesting because every time they would speak to the commentator after their performances, they really emphasized the incredible support of their team, their coaches, their mentors, and how they almost had won it for the team. Like, yes, it was an individual performance that was incredible, outstanding, best in the world, but it was also reflective of that team's camaraderie, that ability to rely on one another, to form a close-knit community, to strive for high standards, to have this resilience and this kind of commitment to hard work. Because a lot of the people involved in the Winter Olympics have, come in with next to no money. There's not a lot of funding. Like it's really about that drive and that ability to be the best. So there's strong accountability to performance, but it's buffered by this incredible team environment that's promoted in that community. So, like, yes, there's a training centre that's been built in Brisbane. Yes, the government have put a lot of money into improving sports in that area, etc. There's some strategic components, but it's the people and the safety they create for one another that really promotes this feeling of we're in it together alongside that striving for individual performance. So to me, there's both psych safety and accountability. We're not compromising standards. We're not saying it's okay not to perform. We're not, allowing for not maximum effort. We're still pushing, we're still driving, we're still kind of banding together to do that. But we're also going to offer each other mentoring, care, companionship, and all of those pieces as well. So there's a buffering that happens, and the two sit really nicely side by side. You made a funny point in rehearsal, Kev, about maybe it's got something to do with the extreme nature of the sport too, and perhaps that is part of it.
It
Mm.
seems like, yeah, where the stakes are higher,
Mm,
it's much more important to have like high psychological safety. Like, and when you
Mm.
think about those situations where you have to be able to pull someone up for your own safety, like, oh, this is dangerous or this is going to go wrong. Like in any environment where you need to be able to do that for a higher risk reason, then that psych
mm.
safety needs to be way, way, way higher. So in those where they have to say to each other, this isn't working, the way that you're leaning into that turn or the way that you're doing that
Yeah, yeah,
is going to kill both of us. Like you need to be able to say that to someone. And it'll be
yeah.
the same
Good
in
point.
in professions that require the more dangerous construction work or more dangerous drilling
Mhm.
work or hospitals. They're the situations where people both need to be able to trust each other, be accountable for the things that they do, and also be able to bring up anything that occurs so that everyone's going forward with the same mindset.
Like I think we were talking earlier around this idea of if you're a leader and you've excused someone once, that's okay. But if you're doing that multiple times, the mistake isn't on the team member, then it's on you as a leader because you haven't rectified that behavior, insisted that that responsibility be carried out, and made that person accountable. So you've got to kind of, I guess, in a leadership role, go, yes, I've got to have some tolerance of mistakes and, put training in place or support that person to get better, etc. That's our role as leaders. That's all understood. Having said that, though, if mistakes are repeated or responsibilities aren't picked up continually, then becomes your failure as a leader. If you're allowing other members of the team to step in and to kind of rectify those challenges. So I think we've got to be really careful with psych safety and not promote it in the sense where we're excusing people, because it has to be about people meeting their commitments. So it's this idea of you're expected to challenge ideas, but you are also expected to meet your commitments.
Likewise, and I think the piece in here too is that moving from personal blame to task accountability that you've referenced there is a piece that we shouldn't lose in the conversation with the person who is responsible for it. Like, don't talk about them, talk to them as leaders, sitting in that moment, and then just asking them the questions around. So, when you play that task or that piece that you miss back out, what's the lesson or what do you need to do to make that look differently next time? That's important for them to actually go through that process and feel those lumps and bumps a little bit. That's how you're going to get them to change and correct it. If we just excuse it and we don't address it, what will we expect to happen next time? Is
Yeah.
how I always look at that. Like, if I want to be more frustrated as a leader, then I will not bring it up. That's honestly, I'd rather have the uncomfortable moment, because I actually love it when people take responsibility and they go, "Oh God, it's really obvious now," because that's actually a light bulb moment for them and for you as a leader to feel that. Hmm.
Yeah.
To clarify, me and Ben had that experience the other day.
We did.
I made an error. And Ben asked me what lessons I learned from it, and I had to sit in that spot of being uncomfortable while I explained what it was and went over it in my head too and got it out. And like that, me processing it, it's not a mistake I'll make again. So it was really useful as much as it was
Painful.
uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'm good with it because I know, Kev, I know that we got there, but I think the ability for us to have those conversations, I love it because it's like that's how real growth can happen
Mm.
amongst peers in organizations. And honestly, if you're working towards getting different outcomes or ambitious outcomes, you actually need that because you can't do it all yourself. So it's like, oh God, let's get more people thinking about what role they can play.
We did have one tip to offer in response to our question we got through about building psych safety in jaded workplaces. So, thinking about that, I think obviously there's kind of a movement from includer safety that happens all the way through to contributor safety to challenger safety. Like psych safety doesn't happen overnight. So, includer safety is kind of where we need to start on that. But I think in that instance, it's a case of what's the intervention that needs to happen now, and then what's the initiative, the long-term initiative to build toward, greater psych safety and eventually result in more challenger safety. So, what's the intervention that needs to happen now to kind of lift people out of this jaded mindset? And who is in that mindset? What does it look like and how is it showing up? And is there data to support that? Really digging into that or getting that data is going to be important to diagnose a problem properly and put that intervention in place, and all the while building a strategy that's going to move that organisation from includer to learner to contributor all the way through to challenger safety.